Efficiency Committee. We are waiting for City Controller Wendy Gruhl to present on item number 1.
Are you expecting the other members too?
Yes.
That's Cammy and Aurora. Cammy and Aurora in the Sarah's office. They're the principal grant coordinators.
And then there's
So, yeah, I know usually I sit here, but I might just hang back with them.
Is your bus coming? John, is your bus coming?
Yep. As soon as I call him.
The parts is coming here.
Didn't know our ceiling was John.
Wow,
Exciting.
nice to see you too.
miss my colleague by voting officials.
Politics, but, you know.
What are you gonna do?
Well, we have a quorum, and our esteemed city controller is here, Wendy Gruhl, if you'd like to make a presentation on the first item.
Thank you. I like that, esteemed. I hope 6 months from now you'll say that same thing.
Oh, we know we will.
Just don't audit our offices.
That's right, exactly. Thank you, Greg. I heard on this morning, I went out to Sunland Tahunga. I've been monitoring, went out last night, and I know you've been monitoring that too. And I said, even though I'm not the council member, I am the controller for the city, so I went out there, and they're doing a great job.
Amazing.
And it's amazing.
Base camp is amazing.
And it is one of those things where there is, sorry to delay, to diverge here from this, but you know that sometimes the fire coming as close as it can is good because the brush is gone and they no longer have to worry about that. That's the good news, bad news. But in some areas they'll be able to make sure. But it did get awfully close, I have to say. And at nighttime you can sure see it very differently than during the day when you can't really see where that is actually coming forward. So, well, thank you, Paul, Mr. Chairman, and the members of the committee. I'm very excited about this new committee. And particularly for you inviting me today. I know that from personal experience that audits might not always be the most glamorous committee, but I can tell you from experience that it is one of the most important. And I think it is one of the most transformative, where we can look at real noticeable change that can occur. And with our city facing a massive budget deficit, believe dramatic change is needed. And as a past member of this committee, and as actually a chairperson of this committee several years ago, we used the audit recommendations to help shape and implement efficiencies to create a more effective and implement a transparent government. And I think I'm looking forward to a real fresh start, a new era of cooperation between the Controller's Office and this committee and the chair, particularly the committee, and the council as a whole, because I think we need to work collaboratively to implement these recommendations so they don't just sit on the shelf. We have a wonderful audit team. There's a lot of things that I have learned in my brief now 2 months as the city controller, and something that I always knew, but now from being there, that we have really a great team that does a lot with not a lot of money and not a lot of resources. We're 40% down on the audit section of the controller's office, and that can have a big impact going forward. I also want to hear your ideas for problems or constituents are having. I've had the opportunity to meet with almost all of the council members to say, not only am I coming forward with my ideas, but you all and your constituents have some great ideas on things that we can audit. There are some forms that aren't a full-fledged audit, those that are just a review or a study that we can work together to identify. Clearly, resources are always an issue, but we want to work with you. Some things really, I think, are critically important, and we need to move things around and take care of them. And an important first step, and as you chair the committee, we discussed this, was to bring forward literally the dozens of audits that have not been heard by this committee or the full council. And a number of the significant audits that have been released since July of 2004 have not been heard. We went through council file. I know your staff similarly to that. We prepared and provided to you, I think, this morning or late last night, a list of the various ones, and I want to just highlight a few that stand out to us. One is, and this relates to your committee, Mr. Smith, as well, which is the review of increased civilianization of the police department. That is a critical audit, one that, again, difficult times, but is something we talk about, that we could have more police officers on the street if they were not sitting behind a desk doing really jobs that should be for other people. And so would love, and again, you and I have talked about that. The performance audit of the City of LA's process for planning conditions for development. As you know, we've worked really hard, and I know you will as a council member as well, to have conditions that mitigate any potential problems or issues that would impact a neighbor or a constituency. And the audit that had been performed showed that there was not a lot of follow-through, and unless you had a very active neighborhood council or homeowners organization, whatever, sometimes the conditions were never implemented. And I know for me, one of my favorite stories of being a council member, it's actually in your district, Paul, but it was in the that flag, as we call it, between the CD2 and CD5, where there was a Pizza Hut, and they were supposed to have repaved the sidewalk, and you saw one side of the street on Magnolia, beautifully paved sidewalk, looked wonderful, and on the other side there was asphalt on top of the sidewalk. Looked horrible, dangerous, all that you can think of. And so we called, and Building and Safety had given them a temporary CFO, and it had been 2 years. And finally, and again, I drove by it so much, and I was not thinking that it was on, one wrong side of the street. But we called, and they said, "Oh, it's too expensive now to do." The owner of the property, and I said, "That's too bad. We'll pull your CFO." Now, if I hadn't done that, or if a constituency, it might not have happened. And so this is the issue that we want to look at. It's both on a planning and a building and safety level. The other is there's a number of audits of the Department of Animal Services that have never been heard. Again, cross-section of your two committees. Still in your committee, isn't it, Mr. Smith?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
We're doing that list now.
Yes. And then the LA City's hiring process performance audit. And again, there's a wealth of recommendations that will help our city streamline their processes and particularly implement stronger controls for waste, fraud, and abuse. And so virtually nothing has happened on these audits. What we did find is someone might introduce a motion that had a piece of the audit, and the motion might have been heard, but the audit was never heard. Sometimes neither had been heard. And so this is, and I'm not sure, hopefully we should have provided it to all of the committee members, and if not, you'll get one this afternoon as well. And so I think we could look at saving millions of dollars in that way. Now, without going into too much detail, because I'm learning that the element of surprise is a little bit of a good part of this job and a useful tool. I do want to give you a preview of some of the things that we are looking at. Of course, first and foremost is looking at saving taxpayer dollars and looking at waste, fraud, and abuse, whether it's contracts or kickbacks or other things. We really need to make sure that with the limited resources we spend them wisely. As you may recall, hello, Mr. Parks, recently there was a judgment against Prestige Parking, and that was based on someone providing to our office and others with the Office of Finance. Our Waste, Fraud, and Abuse Unit worked very diligently to provide the information to the city attorney and to be able to prosecute that case. And they were effective in the criminal, and they're going forward on the civil case, which could mean millions of dollars for the city of Los Angeles. Another is, of course, jobs, and jobs. Hi, Mr. LaBonge. We're going to look at ways in which we can stimulate the economy and what we can help to bring businesses in and hopefully not only help those businesses survive, but hopefully expand. There's been a lot of studies and reports that have been out there, and we have everything from the 100 recommendations that came through the LAEGC report. We have things that have been done in the past. We don't want to recreate the wheel, and we're looking, is there a way to kind of compile, and we're working with the Office of Finance, and I know some motions that have come through council, but to say, let's stop talking and take action on those items that need to move forward. And so we'll be a partner in that process. Green audits, how we can operate in a more energy efficient manner, which will help our environment, but also help us save money. Transportation. Know that well, and so there are lots of things that I would like to look at in cooperation with the department, but making sure that our money is being spent wisely, to also look at some of the parking issues I know was discussed a little bit. I didn't hear today in council, but was on the agenda today on the P3. And stimulus dollars. We are wanting to make sure that we're spending those monies effectively, and that it will not diminish our opportunity in the future to get additional stimulus funds. And so we have begun working with the CAO and department staff to ensure that these dollars are spent correctly. We've sent out some direction. I signed another letter today that really gave some outlines for these departments. We're also going to do periodic audits, so we catch some things before it may be going down the wrong path, and working very closely with the CAO's office. And of course, finally, public safety, which is a key part of this, to make sure that we can save money and keep our officers and firefighters on the front lines. Of course, there are a few other things we have up our sleeve, but we'll let you know. One, which I have talked about, which was in budget, which is looking at the DUN's relationship with the neighborhood councils and expenditures. I think that we've found there's not been a lot of monitoring or training in that fact. And so, as I said to a group of neighborhood council leaders the other day, I said, look, it's not going to be pretty for anybody, but what we need to do is have a better system, because as it currently is, it's not working. And DUN was also asking for this audit, so I think they will be very useful in some of its implementation. Two things that we're going to have differently in these audits than in the past is one, in our audits, we will literally have as part of our recommendations not only what the recommendations are, but who's responsible. So you will see that in item number 1, it'll say mayor and council need to adopt ordinance, and then it'll literally have checkmark mayor, council, city attorney's office. So people can look and see exactly who is responsible for each part of the audit implementation and recommendations. And then lastly, we will have a scorecard on our website that people can go on and see when the audit was released, when the departments responded, where we are in each of these recommendations, so a very much transparency. So I want to introduce, I know you all know Fareed, who is the head of our audit division, who's been working very hard to be here today. And of course, Claire Bartels, my chief, I always want to, chief deputy city controller? Is that the right way? Okay. And Daniel Tarika, who is a deputy city controller, and many others that'll be working with us. But we're a lean, mean machine, and we look forward to not only appearing before this committee, but also before the Budget and Finance Committee to talk about what we're doing and how either effective or not, and just to, since all three of you are also on the Budget Committee, is that correct? Right? All three of you. All three on the Budget Committee. We'll also be coming forward periodically with our cash flow, which should be coming up soon. We did a reserve fund letter that came out 2 weeks ago talking about the reserve fund, and that's a part of our department. It's not just audits. Most people think we're only audits, but it's a small part of the larger department, which includes financial reporting and then, of course, demand audit, which is paying all of our bills. And so we are trying to make sure that we're doing all those things effectively and efficiently in that. Pleased to say we had a peer review of our audit team and how they're working, and they gave a clean bill of health of all the things that we're doing. That's required every 3 years, that you have a peer review of your audit team. It's kind of our own audit of our audit team that's been completed. And people come from other cities and states to look at how we're doing things. And so we were happy to get a great letter from them. So I'm looking forward to this committee and working with you, Paul, and I'm really happy that you wanted this committee and we have the chance to work together. So with that, I welcome any questions or issues.
Thank you, and I'm certainly looking forward to working with you as well. The audits that you highlighted, I think, are all high priority for me personally, particularly the one on looking at greater civilianization of the police department, which I think is one of the places where we can find some significant savings, and right now we're pretty desperate to do that. One of the areas, if you don't have it, already, in your pipeline, I think we should also look at similarly is the same issue and the issue of deployment within the fire department, because as we're cutting somewhere between $39 and $52 million currently, and cutting back deployments, which certainly concern me greatly. I think if we can find some places to save money in that same department, that would be of significant help, especially going forward. So otherwise, we look forward to working with you and to implementing the good ideas that come from these audits. And as an outside observer in years past, I found that, I felt that Laura Chick had a number of good audits and not enough of the good elements of those were implemented. And that's something I certainly would look to rectify as chair of this committee.
Great. And we hope that some of those audits that will come forward we will recommend as well that may be useful to other departments. So if we found a problem in cash management in this department, we would probably share with other departments how things that they could improve upon, so we don't have to recreate the wheel in doing that.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea, and I think that's also been problematic in the city's history. We'll change something in one department and do it better, but not necessarily have adequate communication across the board. So I'm glad to hear that as well.
Great.
Any other comments from colleagues?
Yeah, just a couple. As you look at Dunn, one thing I hope you'll do, and I understand they've taken a look at it and they don't have a clue how to solve it, but they've begun to look at all the neighborhood council's purchases of equipment such as computer systems, phone systems, PAs, et cetera. There's no accounting within Dunn or record keeping done within Dunn, not to be redundant. There needs to be some sort of system established, record keeping system of where the equipment is, who has it, et cetera, because I got a feeling an awful lot of this stuff has disappeared into personal use. In fact, I know of some cases specifically. So I hope when you do that, Dunn, that you'll take a look at the equipment purchases that has gone on for years. And second is maybe as much a budget request as anything, but as long as you're here today, you mentioned that you do other things other than audit, but on the cash burn that we're going through, we're spending, what, $1 million per payroll period more than we have?
I wish. 10.
Million what?
Million a day.
Million a day.
Yeah, so about 10 million.
10 million per payroll period. Do you have a date when you see us exclusive of the TRAN, which covers for a while, when we would run out of cash at the current rate?
It hasn't been, I'll look to Claire too, because it hasn't been provided in the letter that we're coming forth, and the cash flow kind of talks about the number, so and it is the $10 million per pay period.
Per pay period.
Yes.
We don't know, since we do not have a date certain,
But,
we are,
You could have,
still are under from our letter for
Yeah,
spending,
okay.
but it's the huge pending decision.
mhm.
but we might be able to, I think what might be helpful is extrapolate if it's so much per pay period and
Yeah.
looking at that, so we might.
Yeah.
Before the end of next year,
Okay.
that would be fair to say, is what it will be.
I would think it would be beneficial to us, certainly to the members of the Budget and Finance Committee, that you maybe do a monthly update on that.
Yes.
And I think we need to keep that in front of us always, because we're going to be doing decisions constantly throughout the coming year that's going to change that equation a lot. And,
But its relationship to the TRAN
Yeah.
particularly, I think, is the,
well, the TRAN covers our
right,
reserve for a short time,
till,
and that's just a loan, so that's the problem. There are still members of this council I don't think that believe we're going to run out of money. It's just amazing, but that's the way it is. And so I think it's important for them to keep that in front of them, so I'd appreciate if you do
and
that.
I think that we see our role sometimes of being, we tease, I think Bill Lamb says he's gloom, and maybe Claire, you're doom, or
Yeah.
somebody.
You're the new doom? Oh.
Gloom and doom, but it, oh, it's Ben Seha, sorry, that's right. Which one was gloom or doom?
Well, he
But I
looks like
think-
both.
Yeah,
He always-
I know. But I think we do see our role as coming in with the independent, here are the facts. I mean, all the information the CAO gets is really from the information that's extrapolated from all the data that the controller puts together. So I think you'll see us communicate more frequently about our situation on reserve and cash flow and other kind of financial situations that haven't necessarily been put forward before by the controller's office.
Great. And one last thing is that Chairman mentioned about the fire department. I don't think we've ever done a civilianization study on the fire department. We've done it on the police a couple times, but never done it on the fire, have we?
There's one dispatch.
Dispatch, that's a small, yeah. Whatever, there's always tremendous resistance in the fire department, as in the police, but more, I think, in the
More in the
fire
fire.
department to any kind of civilization. Now, as we look at the reductions and the gap that still exists in the fire budget, those kind of discussions have more relevance than ever before. So I concur with that viewpoint and would appreciate that.
Yeah, okay. And I believe one of the items, sorry, is that may have not had the follow-up, and I'll look to Fareed, is the dispatch item, if it ever came back to council.
You need to bring it up now.
Has it come back yet?
Very Sephora. We had a number of presentation on the dispatch audit. but it was never came to the conclusion whether the department is going to implement the recommendation or not. It was all resistance, basically,
Yeah.
in terms of not to follow the recommendations. So his item is still pending.
If we leave it up to them, it'll never happen. And
That's probably correct.
Certainly now with the new chief coming in, this would seem like a good time to raise those kinds of issues.
I have to say, they were very cognizant in my review last night and going with the fire department of over time, kind of figuring out in their resources that, and I noticed that even with the other fires of doing what they need to do for public safety, but also kind of doing it within their budget that they thought and so forth. So I think I've seen them be cognizant of the problems.
It was very interesting last night when I met with the chiefs out there, that they were very, very vigilant in making sure everybody there gets signed in, because then you get reimbursement.
Right.
And it's to our advantage to have, we got to send a few more divisions out there probably, because then it's 75% paid for. So, but anyway, they're very cognizant that they need to sign in and they need to make sure they're covered for reimbursement. So they're doing a good job, I think, in that.
Yes. And the thing that impressed me was going in the various kind of pressure points up in Sunland and Tahunga was fire department, LAFD was there, but you had a lot, almost probably more from other departments that were at those locations than even LAFD. So Wyoming, Chula Vista, Monterey, Montague, I don't know exactly where that was from, but they were all another group. So it was very impressive,
Yes,
the kind of partnership.
I did.
Congratulations on today in the,
We have one more reading.
you knew what I was going to say, didn't you? Special events.
It's only been 8 years. Let me just ask a couple of things. Is that one of the things that, and I think we've asked the controller on this for a couple of years, I think we have over 1,100 special accounts. And at one time we asked, and I think it's been a couple of different times in a couple of different languages, we said, can we get a review of those and get rid of those? So it certainly would be a benefit to the controller and everyone else that we got rid of accounts that were dormant and we just leave them in play. The other issue is, I think, and we're just catching up on the audit committee, is that there's a lot of good stuff that's happened, but it just kind of lingers. And it just seems as though we'd hope that you would be that lightning rod that would say that's in 2006 this was done and nobody's done anything with it. Otherwise, it just kind of sits in different committees and goes by the wayside. And it would be important.
And we will provide to you, I mentioned it earlier, I think before you arrived, that we've put together a chart, and I think it was like 46% of them since 2004 had not been heard by this committee. And so we will follow those. We're also looking at even those that have been heard that had a 90-day report back, which is the kiss of death, and that never comes back. So we're looking through each audit and to say where there's certain things that we really want to push through that never happened. So Fareed's staff is doing that with us. Again, they did a whole lot of work on these audits and came up with some great recommendations that sometimes get one-day story but never get followed through. And so that's what we want to be known for, is that it's not only the audits coming out, but that we make sure the recommendations are adopted and implemented.
And we just did a motion the other day, and it's going to go for ordinance. And one of the things we constantly are creating major policies, major changes, but we never have a report back a year later to see, did it ever do what it was intended? Did we find out 6 years later it never got implemented? And so we just asked the city attorney that they put it as part of the ordinance, that on major policy, law changes, directions, that it be a required one-year report back to determine if the concerned units are actually doing what the intended purpose was.
It's one of the issues on green audits that we've talked about and looking at environment. We have adopted numerous environmentally, sensitive, smart, all these things, and whether or not they've actually been implemented over that period of time. I always go back to our left-hand turn signal issue, which was 9 months down the road and then decided not to do it. So I think we'd be more than happy if you say, whatever happened on that, give us some ideas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then one of the things, I think it came up in the ERC today, we're still working under some very arcane personnel rules, and we also can go back and look at our administrative code. That it's been changed incrementally, but over time, if you keep changing it incrementally, you think you have a horse and you find out you have a camel, and so it just, you know, it doesn't work after a while.
And we've been working with your staff. I know we met with you. We shared with you that was one of the things we wanted to look at was the admin code. And interestingly enough, when I had a meeting with all of the general managers, which had never occurred before between the controller and the general managers, all in one room. I think I said they were probably days they were going to love to hate me, but most of all, hopefully we would work together. And I think they were just curious as to what I was going to say. But we asked them, what are some common themes that you would see that if we did an audit that would be helpful to all of you? All of them came forward with looking at the admin code, that oftentimes can constrain them from being able to implement a lot of recommendations. And the second piece of that was also looking at contracting and the importance of how lessons learned from one and how disparate it was. And so that's one of the things we've been talking about. We meet on a weekly basis, and I think Fareed doesn't want me to come to him anymore because I come up with all these ideas, partly from some of you, and he goes, we only have so much money. So I think one of the items that the Waste, Fraud, and Abuse Unit, which we're going to come forward potentially with some other items, but is, the ideas of, and Brian, who serves on it, is the one who did this prestige parking with the Office of Finance, really did all of the legwork, and on a couple of the items you will see publicly in a few weeks. One person does not make the ability to do all that we want to do, and it's a very effective unit in with the resources we have. So it'll be something we'll talk about.
And my final deal is, you mentioned the fire department earlier with the civilianization. One of the areas that we've asked for probably 5 years in a row is for them to look at constant staffing. And I think from my basic awareness of it, it appears that it's gone differently than what was intended. It was originally invented to save money in the sense of rather than hire people. But what I think has occurred over time is that we've allowed every new person that comes in the fire department, that's an increase, to become part of constant staffing. And so we have no basically field resources to move around, to touch some of the places that may have a shortage or to fill some gaps. So even though the fire department is the largest it's ever been in history, we have to deploy, I think it's 1,100 plus people every day to meet constant staffing, or else, and they have about 200 vacancies a day. So that means we got to put 200 people on overtime. And it just seems as though somewhere, some of those bodies we added from when the fire department was at 2,000 or less and got to 3,000, some of those should not have been in constant staffing, and they should be used in another fashion. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, we just keep growing the overtime budget. Now it's well over $100 million. And so we've asked several times, but it's one of those issues that the fire department will never come to grips with on their own, that to look at another way of deploying resources that do not add to that $100 million budget of overtime. Because if we grew to 5,000, every one we add goes into constant staffing, and away we go, and we just keep adding overtime. So it would be very helpful for some outside look at constant staffing and seeing whether there's a lower minimum that talks about, like the police had basic cars, and that was the basic number of cars, everything else was field. They just view everybody as necessary, and there is no field operation.
And I'd just add to the point that I think you made, that if you were just listening to the news, you would think that we would have solved all the problems of the city a couple times over, because ideas were introduced, audits were done, motions were made at various stages. It seemed like something was done in a lot of good areas, but much of that never reached the goal line. And so hopefully we can work together in the next few years to identify some of the best ideas, capture them, move them along, and make sure they are focused on until they're not only passed but implemented.
Implemented, yes.
And I can tell you from my experience in 6 years in the legislature, we got a lot of good laws passed that were never implemented. Yeah. And so it can sound like you've done some good things, and you can think you've done some good things. At the state level, if the governor's office doesn't push it through, it may never get done. Yeah. So I think we need to take the time and we're both coming in from the beginning here, so we'll have 8 years to work together on a number of these things and make sure they get followed through until they're actually implemented and they're really the policy of the city.
And we hope, again, by the, after a year to be able to say, here's our accomplishments, here's how much money we saved, here's what's been implemented, and to have some real tangible results, we think is important. So,
Well, that sounds like a plan for all of us.
great. And I know, thank you for having me in item number 2, which I'm not able to stay for, but on the grants program, I think they're, although going in the right direction of trying to reduce, the timing, there is no, there's no stick necessarily if you don't meet those deadlines. And so I think that as you look at that, that would be important going forward. And for you to be here to respond to any of the audit recommendations. I know it's been heard, but this is the CLA report that's coming forward. So,
Well, thank you so
Look
much.
forward to seeing you again. I did not miss the 5 hours you had in council today, just so you know. I did a lot during that 5 hours. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank you for being here. We look forward to working with you in the years ahead.
Item number 2 is Chief Legislative Analyst Report relative to the supplemental report on grants ordinance and proposed pilot program in response to Controller's performance audit of the city's grant seeking and administration process.
Whoever would like to start?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and committee members. John Deering with the CLA's office. I'm joined up here by Cami Fong from the CAO. This item has been addressed by the prior audits committee and the prior chair. We've had a couple hearings along the way since the introduction of the controller's audit some time ago. So I guess I'll just give a little bit of background as to how this came about, but I think we'll be, starting from square one based on the audit findings and what the CAO was charged with responding to. The audit relates to the city's grants process and improving it from start to finish, both on the application side and the approval side of for funding, reducing some of the delays that are commonly associated with it, and ensuring that each entity that feeds into the process, whether it's the department, the CAO, or ultimately the council as the decision makers for approval of applications and grant awards, to ensure that to minimize delays that are often part of that process that can ultimately lead to or compromise the city's ability to expend funds in a timely manner or ultimately reapply for certain grants. So just in short, what I think the CAO and the CLA in conjunction with the CAO had been looking at were 3 major areas in responding to the audit. One of the major findings was being able to increase centralization of the city's grant activity via the CAO. The other was reviewing the grants ordinance and some of the requirements that tend to be a little bit more obsolete and don't have as practical an application, specifically with respect to how grant applications are ultimately approved and the timelines associated with that. I'll let Cami get into that a little bit more. And the third component was being able to modernize the process and rely more on a database to ensure that all information is submitted in a timely and accurate manner for that increased centralization and tracking. So with that.
Great. As an initial first step, this office, in conjunction with the CLA, has reviewed the grants ordinance and developed proposed changes for an expedited grant application and acceptance approval process that would be implemented in a 6-month pilot program with 5 city departments. And we identified the community development department, aging, city attorney, sanitation, and environmental affairs. These streamlining measures were developed with the goal of meeting both the audit recommendations and took into consideration grant practices identified in both the audit and reviewed by this office. The goal of the pilot program is to streamline and shorten the city's grant application and submission processes, develop standard processes for all grant cycle phases, provide the mayor and council with regular reporting on departmental grant activity, and develop a comprehensive grants management database for grants tracking. So also during the pilot program, we plan to work with the participating departments to assess and, if appropriate, modify procedures in the grants process. And upon completion of the 6-month pilot program, the CAO will report back with recommendations for citywide implementation.
How long will it be before the pilot program becomes active?
We would probably spend about a month preparing procedures and working with the department to make sure there's consensus with how they're supposed to implement things. But we'd be able to get up and running within a month.
And you'd be providing training to staff of the participating departments on how to do this?
Yes. And we also have a grants database, eCivis, in which we would train them. It's going to be the same database that we are currently using for the ARA stimulus grants. So most of those departments do have ARA grants, so they're going to be familiar with the database already.
And would you be working to get input from all the departments on how to change this process, or have you already done that?
No, we'd be working with them to do that during the process.
Any other questions?
You know, one thing, and I think from the report that was done shows that since '97, there's been about 5 different motions asking for some kind of way to deal with grant management. And I think we, at least in maybe 3 or 4 budgets, verbally asked the CAO to take this on as a project. And I was just concerned that after all that energy and time, and the report that lays out pretty much what most people agree are the problems, we'd come up with a pilot instead of a proposal on how to revamp these existing systems. And when we look at the amount of money, I mean, we looked at one year, I think it's over $500 million in grants. And the reason that we added in the definition of the budget committee's responsibilities is grants that have an impact on the general fund is because the policy committees often do not look at the overall financial impact. If they're positions that are in this year's budget, they actually, and in fact, many times the CAO report will say no general fund impact, even though there may be several bodies that are in the budget to perform the task. And we have this historical issue of front loading. We never quite know how soon we get paid back. We have also the growth of the grants well beyond the requirement of the grant. And with all those things going on, it just would appear that we'd have had a more aggressive approach to say, let's get this thing going, or look at the top 10 departments that have grants that come in or something to where we get the bulk of them under some reign as it relates to addressing the issue. And it just seems like we're, after over 10 years going on almost 15, that we're still tippy-toeing through a process that we know is broken, fractured, and it's impacting a variety of things in addition to the general fund. And I'm just wondering why we took such a approach as opposed to looking at that 10 or 12 years of frustration and trying to create a program that would address more of the issues.
I think it's been difficult to bring about change. You're right.
It's been very difficult. We talk about it every budget session, and they smile and nod at us and say it's a summer study, and we go back to next year, and it's a summer study, and yet we know that all this leakage is going on in the sense of, in fact, it takes a lot of dollars out of our hands in the budget committee because people are accounting for them as part of their grant, which then either we're front-loading them or we're not getting our refunds back or whatever, and it makes a tremendous hit on the general fund. And I would have, when I looked at it, first thing I was thinking is that it is such a big problem that we're well beyond a pilot, and that we are well beyond finding 5 departments that say, let's try it. And what are we going to know in 6 months that we don't know now? We're going to know in 6 months it's a tough problem. and we've not dealt with it. And we got 15 years or so of history of asking about it, but not basically addressing it.
Aurora Bracia with the CAO's office. Councilman, you're correct. This has been an ongoing issue and a concern of making sure that we have a centralized place for understanding where grant funds are expended and how successful we are in retaining the funds that we have. And there has been a history of funds that have been lost because there has been a lack of coordination and other issues. What we attempted to do in this pilot program is to utilize existing resources to try to map out the proper path for going with a longer plan for implementation. What this does, it does not yet require change in the ordinance, and so this is really, it's a short-term pilot project using existing resources for both the grants tracking and the staff to do this effort, so that we can come back to you with what would be the full implementation. We don't necessarily have the resources, or we don't have the impact assessment of going forward, because it is a huge effort for the city to now change direction and provide information to the mayor and the council, which I think they certainly deserve to know because it's an important issue. The ARA tracking has been a fortunate precursor to the activity, and we've modeled a lot of what we're proposing on that as well. So it's the momentum of the ARA grants tracking that we're trying to follow in the path. We're not changing the ordinance now. I know there was a comment made by Wendy Gruhl that there isn't any, I guess there isn't any teeth in the compliance portion of this, and that's absolutely true as well. But whether or not we wanted to make those changes before we had a chance to understand how the implementation within all the departments of the city, that's why at this point we were willing to go with a pilot, because it didn't cost any additional resources, and we can come back and then let you know what it would take in terms of implementation, both from the ordinance changes, working with the city attorney, and from the departments to know what and how the reporting relationship would work.
Yeah. But I think if you go back to somewhere like 06, 07 budget, or maybe earlier, I think the CAO received at least 2, maybe 3 positions for this specific activity. And as we watched it and waited, and then we found out that maybe they were put in other functions as opposed to addressing that issue. But if you go back in the last 5 years, you'll see that there were positions actually basically funded to deal with centralizing and addressing the whole issue of grants.
I know that we filled Cammie's position, which is one of the 2. I don't believe there was ever any more than 2. I'm not even sure about the second. We can certainly look into that. But there has been some coordinated activity that we have performed. It has just been limited because of our ability to do everything that's desired. Certainly there's a lot of work to be done in coordinating it, but so there has been, I don't know if Cammie, you want to describe some of the activities that you've been involved with in grants coordination. It's been more from an informational perspective rather than a coordination and an enforcement. There's 2 different things that I think you're looking for, both better coordination but also the ability to work with the departments and make them accountable for how they spend their funds. And that's what we have not been able to do with decreased resources within our own office. And so we've got a limited effort in place, and we're just continuing that for this pilot at this point.
But if you go back, like I said, look 5 years ago, and you'll see specifically funds were allocated specifically for this task with the same issues we know today as problems. And we waited and waited and waited, and now that we're in a downsize, I don't know if we can use the fact that we're all suffering from budget cuts, but that we gave the CAO 5-year head start to address this, and that was done. In fact, one of the frustrations, the reason for this audit, was that we didn't see any progress done on these annual budget reviews, and finally we asked the controller to audit the whole process and maybe create a game plan, because we were waiting for the CAO to take on this and basically move with it. But it's been, I know the 5 or 6 years I've been here, it's been an annual budget discussion of what are we doing about this whole grant issue. And we were just fortunate in the last year to get the budget committee involved with block grant. In fact, we were losing like $4 million a year in general fund money to support block grant. We finally gotten that down to almost 0. But these are the things we talk about. We keep waiting and waiting. And like I said, I just would like to see, as you look at this, is that we'd be far more aggressive than the pilot. And the most obvious when we look at this dollar police department probably has some of, if not the largest amount of dollars in grants. They certainly have some of the grants with individual grants with a ton of money per grant. And we're talking about bodies and things of that nature. They're not even on our list of the 5. So I just would like to see, as you tackle this, that we be far more aggressive, because this is a 15-year dance that we're in, and we just have not made the progress that I think a lot of us thought we'd be making.
It would be our hope that if this were approved, that we would be able to come back within the time period that we've mentioned to be able to lay out something that is far more aggressive, and we would be able to identify the changes that would need to be made on a citywide basis.
But the thing is, even on this, if we go 5-6 months, we'd be missing next year's budget cycle. And so if we miss next year's budget cycle, that puts us 18 months down the road to say we can even respond to the 6-month pilot. So, I don't know. I just would like to see us do more quicker.
Is there a viable way to do that? If we approach this differently, including all the city departments rather than as a pilot, could we, as a practical matter, get that done in this period of time?
I think we'd have to take a look and we'd come back to you to discuss what implications that would be operationally within our own office as well as other departments.
Yeah, the one advantage you have is you help the mayor write the budget before the council sees it. And so I think what Mr. Parks is alluding to is you need to be very vigilant as that discussion goes forward with the mayor in the preparation of the budget, which begins in November, December, and actually bringing forward to them while you're still in your phase of your temporary program here, making recommendations for next year's budget during that time frame.
Certainly, at a minimum, as was mentioned, you should probably add the police department to the pilot. If
You know, that's a
at all
couple
possible.
people right there alone. You know, that's the problem. And I think what we envisioned was that eventually that function, which is now resting in the mayor's office, will be transferred to CAO or wherever this grants operation is. That was the original discussions going back, as Mr. Parks said, a couple of years. There are people that do nothing but work on grants in the mayor's office, and that, you know, we 20 years ago, the city of LA had a grants board. Every grant went through the grants board, and the grants board consisted of the mayor's representative, the head of the general CDD department, and the council's designee for the grants committee, which we had a grants committee at the time. And it ran really well. And then we devolved it into the system where it's a free-for-all, every department takes care of their own, and it's gotten totally out of control. And so I think what the audit said is bring focus back to it, bring it back under one control, so we can see what we're doing. And so I hope we will get to that point. You need to make sure we're vigilant in that budget process for next year, that we head toward back where we used to do it very well. We did it really well back then.
Historically, why did it get diffused?
You know, part of it was because there was a lot of change in the CDD department, and they wanted to just get it off their back, because there were a lot of departments, particularly the police department, that were doing a lot of grant applications at the time, and they just didn't want to do grant stuff for other people. And then why we got rid of the grants board, I don't even remember. You know, I was here at the time, I just don't remember. But it was a big mistake, I think. So I hope we'll get back to that. And I want to see, and it's something I've complained about in budget and finance, is that we see too often grants that are historic grants that you can't ask people now, why are we even doing it? Nobody even really remembers why we're doing it anymore. We've done it forever, so we just keep doing it. But also, some of those grants have been reduced, where we start off at 80% grant, we're down to 45 sometimes. And you have to say, is there value for the city anymore? And I hope as part of you, as you begin to build this new grants program, change in grants, and particularly a decision, is there a value for the dollar, our dollars anymore? It must be part of the discussion now. I look at some things, particularly in the city attorney's office, and say, why are we getting that money anymore? I mean, really, we're spending more than it's worth. Why do we even do it? Because someone's given us money to do something? That's not a good reason. So I hope you'll get into that kind of decision-making where you say, this is not a value for the dollar anymore. We don't need to give 70% of the city's money for that small amount of money for what we get out of it. And then,
I think that's, what we see in budget a lot is somebody gets a grant and we're spending $500,000 for $100,000.
yeah.
And you said, I don't know if we can convince people to make that investment anywhere else except in the city. And particularly, what we also find is departments, and particularly with the city attorney's office, the grant would expire. They would want to keep the people under their, sub-authorities or resolution authorities and just keep floating. Well, that's real city cash dollars that we're expending on something that even the people that gave us the grant didn't think was important to continue. But that's the kind of thing that we really need to add to that review. I think our intent when we talked to the budget committee wasn't that the CAO wrote everybody's grants or all that stuff, but they certainly had to oversee them because they would be in a position to say it's not worth the energy to go forward on this grant. And one of the things we saw a couple of years ago, and certainly we want to commend Department of Aging, they went out and found several grants that help elderly people get their homes repaired. The only problem was they weren't in a position to administer it as well as housing department. So here we have, because the population was seniors, we had aging administering people getting their house repaired, which made no sense at all. And so it took us a year plus to get the two departments to agree that certainly aging should go out and solicit those type of grants, but it really was a housing department implementation. And when after a year and a half, we found out the reason no one wanted to give was it was a matter of one body that aging was afraid they were going to lose. And you say, look at all this over time that we spent over having groups of people do things that they're not capable of doing, yet we're getting a couple $100,000. And again, I think from the CAO's view, we have to start being more critical on when we give bodies, that's a city investment. And there's a tendency when we write the report to say no general fund impact. If you give somebody 4 bodies, that's a general fund impact, whether it's in the budget or not. And we keep reading this where he says no general fund. It appears that the CAO is taking the tack that if it's not additional cash money added to the grant, that's not, that they then label it as a non-general fund. But anytime you put the resources of a body and their salary and their pension and their medical costs as part of out of the city's general fund on a grant, that is a monumental investment in a grant that has to be called general fund impact. And I think that's where we got to pull this stuff together to where it just makes more sense. And again, and I think, and I can't remember when Greg was talking as to why we dismantled it, but we went through these years of decentralizing stuff to where the policy committee was supposedly more in a better position to determine whether the grant was viable. The problem was they never looked at it from the financial impact. And that's where we got into this year after year, and pretty soon we're spending far greater money on general fund than we intended. And what really is a piece of the puzzle we have no idea about is the payback. We never get it within the budget year, and we know particularly, in fact, we don't know often do we get it at all when we're supposed to be reimbursing this. And if we slide 3 months to 4 months on the grant cycle, we know for sure we're not going to get it during that fiscal year. So we're constantly on a catch-up behind something that you're looking at and say, well, first of all, is it even a viable program?
One of the things that we would be including in our pilot program would be a report back to the council after the grant is submitted for application that gives the council more information than they've had in a coordinated effort, which I think is really valuable because it'll give you the opportunity to get a rundown of all of the similar, or most of the facts that you're mentioning, information about the grant, matching funds, impact, fiscal impact, other issues of personnel. They'll be highlighted in a packet that you would be receiving, or the policy board would be receiving, that would give you the opportunity to begin having discussions with those departments about resources before it gets to the application process. So this is an advantage that doesn't currently exist because there isn't a coordinated place to sort of look at all of these. So that is one of the features of the pilot program, is the ability for the council to have a preview after it's gone through application before it gets to the approval process, so that there's issues, concerns, they can be worked or at least addressed prior to you actually having to act on it, which is, I think, you don't have the time at this point. Sometimes things come to you and there's a short deadline and you don't have the ability to discuss it or make decisions based on whether it's in the best interest of the city.
But with the change in the responsibility of the budget finance, we hope that when those packets are made, when we're talking about people being assigned and the city's responsible, and that's our commitment, that packet gets the budget finance consistent as it would be for the policy committee, because that's
Yeah.
where the shortfall is.
Yes, we would make that consistent so that the budget, that the pieces would come together, and then you would have a coordinated impression of, as these grants go forward, of what the details are that are in one place.
Any other questions, comments? If not, I'd suggest that we approve the CLA's recommendations plus our guidance from our discussions, if there's such a motion. Second?
Yeah, second.
Mr. Chair, if I may, just to clarify, as part of the file, I know the agenda only mentions the CLA report. We also recommend that the committee note and file both the CAO report and the controller audit to ensure that that's part of the official record as this moves forward.
Certainly, we'd make that part of this motion.
And let me ask on the committee report, when it comes through, some of the thoughts we had about them looking to expand and things, is that going to be a part of the committee report?
Yes, I'm going to forward it to the CLA person for review before.
Thank you. If there's nothing else, I think we are adjourned. Thank you for your presentations.